Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this lecture we will summarize chapter 4 of Tawney, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. And this is about the rise of the Puritan movement and how it transformed society and thinking about industry and commerce and all attitudes to social obligations. This chapter is about a deep paradox, what the Puritans wanted to achieve and what actually resulted. They were dramatically different. The chapter is divided into 4 sections dealing with the effect of Puritanism on society and how Puritanism itself was a godly discipline, but it turned into a religion of trade, and how the economic pursuit of wealth and profits became a virtue as a result of Puritan philosophy, and how the attitudes toward poverty changed in England. So the first section is about Puritanism in society. There were 3 offshoots of Calvinism that made it to England. The first one was Presbyterianism, which was closest to Calvinism in that it called for a theocratic state, basically religious control of all aspects, including commerce. This had the greatest popularity but the least impact. Congregationalism was about the churches controlling the social life of the congregants without interference from state, and this led to civil rights and religious liberty. And Puritanism was one of the strains of Calvinism, which had to do with the religion being a direct relationship between man and God. And this had the most dramatic effect on society, even though it was the least accepted to the majority. According to traditional history, the Reformation, which was the breaking away of English Church from Catholic Church, was the revolution, but according to Tawney, it was Puritanism which was the real revolution. The Puritan spirit is a single-minded devotion to God. All activities of man, whether at the workplace or at home, they are all spiritual, all directed towards God. The world is a place full of temptations and trials, and our goal is to succeed in avoiding all these distractions and staying on the straight path to God. Since everything is a distraction and everything is an enemy, this gives a human being individualism and willpower. He is to master all opponents. He doesn't care about king or pope or society. He is concentrated, focused solely on getting to God and avoiding all these enemies. This philosophy appealed to the newly emerging commercial classes of England. Puritanism in England was seen as the rebellion of the middle class against the authority of the church and the state. Throughout England, the middle classes, the trading classes, the commercial classes, the industrialists, they were most receptive to Puritanism because it took their work as worship, unlike both the state, which resented their rising power, and the church, which considered their goals of pursuit of wealth and profits to be against religion. Because prosperity was emerging in the commercial classes, the political analysts wrongly thought that tolerance is a key to prosperity. In fact, the Puritans asked for and wanted tolerance because they were not tolerated by the state or the church. But this was just an accident. They were not themselves very tolerant of differences either. Because of their challenge to both state authority and to church doctrine, Puritans were heavily persecuted in England. For a number of reasons, Puritans developed class consciousness. First of all, the class was fairly homogeneous of the middle class. They were independent and they had similar interests and incomes. The hostility, the common hostility of both the church, the aristocrats, the landlords, and the state also served to create a common identity. The self-image of Puritans was a flattering one of being earnest, zealous towards God, punctual in labor, constant in prayer, thrifty and thriving, and filled with pride towards their calling. The second section describes how what Puritans conceived of as a godly discipline turned into the religion of trade. Puritanism embodied two elements which are in conflict with each other. One of them was the individualism, the direct relationship between man and God, and the other was a collectivism, which was an iron discipline imposed by society. The rising prosperity and influence of the Puritanism enabled them to succeed in the parliament in reversing a lot of church controls and church courts, which were able to impose controls on their behavior and restrict the activities of the commercial class. This removal of church controls was by no means a search for freedom, rather it was a search for self-regulation according to the preferred rules and ethics of the Puritans. But it turned out to lead to freedom. Politics enabled the Puritans to remove state controls over commerce, which was in the interest of the state, and the church controls were also removed because the state was jealous of church. So ultimately, all controls, higher order institutional controls on commercial behavior was removed. These controls were replaced by casuistry, that is the Christian code of conduct, which was supposed to apply to the commercial classes and as an internal and social doctrine, not as an enforceable law. The early Puritans had a very vast collection of rules of conduct, both social and commercial, and these were enforced by the church community. Carney remarks that this kind of control which the Puritans wanted was only possible in theocracy. The attempt to enforce social conduct by laws in the parliament failed, and so the parliament abandoned the effect. The church has already been defeated, and this led to freedom for the Puritans to self-organize. But there was an attempt to formulate the new fiqh of the Puritans, that is the new rules of conduct. There were many books written to this end, but there was no enforcement mechanism other than social approbation. So the roots of failure of Puritanism lay within Puritanism. The rules of Christian morality which were expostulated in the books of conduct were very detailed and explicit, but there was no method for institutionalizing them and enforcing them. There appears to be a massive contrast between the iron discipline of Puritanism and the freedom of laissez-faire commerce. But what Tony says is that these ingredients were already present throughout, but they were mixed in different proportions. And so what was the very strong authoritative regimentation turned out to be the route to a libertarian and freedom-oriented laissez-faire conception. The third section is about how the economic virtues, striving for gain, profits, wealth, etc., for one's own self-improvement, these all things which were considered as vices turned into virtues under the influence of Puritanism. The essence of Puritanism was direct communication between the hearts of men and God on an individual and personal basis. And this intense experience of contact with God required a solitary focus, with everything else being regarded as a distraction and an enemy. This led to a renouncement of the social approach to God, the fact that we will together strive towards God and help each other in this. There was no possible help. So Puritanism became a solitary quest for God. There was a reversal of the Christian code of ethics. Instead of working and doing virtuous deeds, the predestination meant that the places in heavens are reserved, but prosperity in this world was taken as a sign of salvation. And so poverty became a sign of the disgrace and non-acceptance of God. Puritans were ascetics in the sense that although they strove for wealth, because wealth was seen as a sign of the approval of God, they were not at all indulgent, or they did not use this wealth for the purposes of luxury or enjoyment. The emerging commercial classes had interests and goals very different from the established aristocratic classes, as well as the established peasantry and the established clergy. So this new way of looking at religion appealed very strongly to the commercial classes and provided them with a weapon in their fight against the church and the state to restrain the rising commercial. From the beginning, there were two strains within Calvinism. One was that the business enterprise was supported as being part of the works of God, but it was to be strongly regulated by discipline of an authority. So these two conflicting tendencies were imposed in Geneva, but could not last because the control eventually broke down and the business classes demanded and achieved independence from all religious control. The same thing happened all over, where the individual and personalized discipline of business was adopted, but the strict regulation of authority from above was abandoned. Through special course of politics, the civil wars in England, there was enough breakup of conventional institutional structures that the church and state regulation of commerce was abandoned, and as a result, Puritans became free to practice their doctrines. Even after formal institutional controls became impossible, there was an attempt by church to control the business by various indirect means, but this did not succeed for a number of reasons. As the Puritans won their battles against church and state, the Puritan doctrine also became transformed as a result of this increasing prosperity. In particular, they started to regard the freedom in trade as a privilege, recognizing the dangers of pursuit of wealth, but this was a secondary. The main goal was pursuit of wealth for the purpose of the glory of God, and there was a recognition that this might actually turn into a personal pursuit, which was a danger but not something which was prohibitive. The Puritans recognized a dual duty. There was a spiritual calling which attracted them towards God, and how it was to be implemented was the temporal calling, and it usually took the form of some business or the other, where the man was to strive mightily in this world in order to get closer to God. So seeking out the calling, the temporal calling, was a weighty responsibility for the Puritans. So the Puritans wanted to devote their whole life to the worship of God, but not by words and by prayers, but by actions. The actions meaning business, commerce, duty, industry, and so on. There was a very stringent code of duties prescribed by the Puritans. No luxury, no taking pleasure, no extravagance. Earning of wealth was a duty and was to be pursued as a duty. Even having friends, etc., was not, and so socializing was frowned upon because it would interfere with the prime duty. Books were written on how the Christian should conduct himself in various pursuits, various religious pursuits, but these books slowly became redundant because it was thought that trade itself was a religion, and so doing trade to the best in the best way possible according to the demands of trade was the name of the calling. So trade itself Puritanism became a religion of trade. So according to this newly emerging doctrine, there was no conflict between Christianity and commerce because commerce itself was Christianity. The meanings of virtue and vice were redefined, and religion was now seen to be in conformity with the requirements of industry and commerce. So what used to be vices, the pursuit of wealth and work and industry as being away from the church, turned into virtues. The virtues which Puritan moralists emphasize on activity, on work, on foresight, on thrift, moderation, self-discipline, calculation, These were all economic virtues, and so basically the ethical principles coincided with the economic efficiency. So the traditional Christian saying that what profits a man if he gains the whole world but thereby loses his soul no longer had any sting, because the Puritans thought that gaining the world was actually to win salvation. In this striving after the world as a religious duty, economic progress became a religious goal. This religious goal was supported by the rise of a new economic theory which looked at the questions of trade purely on a mechanical basis and using the methods of mathematics and science and individualism. This was very strongly aligned with Puritanism, although the two came from independent sources. Some of the characteristics of this was that there was individualism, there was a mechanical, mathematical, and analytical analysis, and the moral casuistry, what you should do and what you should not do, just profits, etc. All of this seemed like ancient superstitions, but this was all very much aligned with the Puritan way of thinking as well. Vast numbers of leading lights of commerce adopted Puritanism. They revolutionized the field. They introduced the latest techniques of commerce and finance. They were independent and proud, and they were detested by the conventional classes as parvenus. But to these people, this Puritan creed, which transformed the acquisition of wealth as a disliked act or a temptation into a moral duty, was very empowering. It was not that the Puritans expelled religion from the worldly life as the secular people did later. They actually made religion the foundation of commercial life. Section of the book shows, fourth section of this chapter shows how Puritanism led to a radical change in attitudes toward poverty. 18th century England had already seen the rise of many changes, the rising tide of individualism. The civil wars led to a discrediting of the ideal of a paternal and authoritarian government and led to less central and more local administrative control. Civil wars also changed a lot of different institutional structures which were governing society, and there was a powerful commercial class which emerged. And also the Puritan philosophy had a lot to do with the changing ideologies towards commerce. There were subtle differences and slips between the actual philosophy of the Puritans and what emerged as a result of this practice. So, for example, the idea that the religion is mainly about the relationship between man and God and an intensely personal matter led to the radically different idea, although very similar on surface, is that religion is purely a personal matter. This was not at all the intent of the Puritans. So everyone must find his own way to the Lord, and we cannot help each other on this quest, does not mean, but was taken to mean, that we have no social obligations. And the kingdom of God is not part of this earth, but this earthly business is also not part of the kingdom of God. These were all slips which occurred in the application of Puritan theology to the real world. One instance of this change was by the changing attitudes towards the enclosures, which is privatization of large segments of land. When Cromwell's revolution against King Charles led to sort of the rise of the public, the people had hopes that this would give them access to lands. But actually the opposite happened. During the revolution, a lot of property was privatized, and these new owners were powerful owning classes, and they resisted successfully the demands for commons and created a philosophy that people had absolute rights to property. Religious theory also changed to accommodate the rising commercial classes, so property became absolutely endorsed by the church, and the search for profits came to be regarded as a virtue. And basically the natural pursuits of human beings came to be seen as part of what was naturally good. So traditional attitudes towards poverty was that it is a social calamity, and that those of us who have money should help the poor, and the poor are the friends of God, and we should help them in order to seek their prayers, and there is a spirit of community and brotherhood which calls for us to help each other in times of need. All this change was as a result of the civil wars. The system of poor relief that was in place was disturbed, and a lot of misery came to the poor because their traditional means of support was removed. But the most significant was the ideological shift. There was no, instead of supporting the poor, the law of God was seen to be that if somebody is not working, then he should not be eating, and the poor should be punished for their sin of laziness and sloth instead of being supported. There was a massive increase in poverty, and combined with a massive increase in ruthlessness and harshness towards poor, which led Jonathan Swift to make a proposal that we should just eat the children of the poor, so that will get rid of two problems at once. The idea that riches are a sign of favor of the Lord and the poverty is a sign of damnation justified the making the life of the poor hell on earth. The moralist said that if we support the poor, that undermines their character, because character is built by industry, which they are forced to work. And the economist also saw that supporting the poor would undermine the incentive to work. And the commercial classes also saw that poor support leads to higher wages, lowers their profits. So there was a combined effort to be harsh towards the poor. Emerging attitudes toward property said that basically your ownership of property is the basis for your participation in society. So people who don't own property, the wage earners, they are not really properly part of society. And the desire of the commercial classes to compete internationally led to their desire to have a cheap and docile labor force, which was again possible by encouraging and supporting poverty instead of the poor. Karl Marx described the harsh attitudes of the bourgeoisie towards the laborers, and these were very much, the sentiments expressed towards labor very much matched the sentiments expressed towards black African slaves. The idea that the poor lower classes must be kept poor so that they will be induced to work became accepted as a trite truism. No need for defense or support of this idea. The key change is that poverty, instead of being regarded as an imposition by external circumstances, came to be regarded as a moral failing. As a result of this, the new Poor Law of 1834 imposed harsh penalties, putting the poor into humiliating and harsh workhouses where they were forced to work on very unfavorable terms as a punishment for being poor. All of this criticism should not allow us to take our eyes away from the positive contributions of Puritanism. And basically this individual nerve of steel standing against all powers is the foundation of democracy, and the virtue of enterprise, diligence and thrift, which are necessary for a productive civilization, are the contribution of Puritanism. There were of course many individuals and also many trends in society which rejected this Puritan severity and combined a religious attitude towards commerce with charity towards the poor, including the Society of Quakers. But these exceptions do not change the general principle. So to conclude this chapter, we can say that Puritans put their private and personal relationship with God at the center of their religion. Their economic philosophy was very stringent. They had to strive to work hard and accumulate wealth without any luxury or without taking any pleasure in this. And they sought to practice their religion free from the constraints of the church and the state. But the results of this led to individualism, hedonism, libertarianism, and outcomes which were radically different from what they sought.